It's an unusual Brothers Grimm story called The Six Servants, and it begins, as of course many stories do, with a beautiful princess. Not just a beautiful princess, but the most beautiful princess in the world. But her mother was not only a queen, but also a sorceress. And of course sorcerers and sorceresses, they use their magic with ill intent. And the queen's intention was that her daughter would stay with her and would never marry. So whenever a suitor arrived at the castle to woo her daughter, the sorceress queen set an impossible task. And when the suitor failed at this impossible task, then his life was forfeit, and the castle executioner would sever his head. But such was the beauty of the princess that the suitors weren't deterred by this, and many young men had lost their lives trying to gain the hand of the princess in marriage. In a neighbouring kingdom was a prince who heard this story and heard about the beauty of the maiden, and he was so determined that he would win her hand that, against his father's wishes, he set off travelling towards the princess castle. And as he was travelling, he met 6 servants, and this is who they were. The first man that he met was the fat man, a man whose size had to be seen but to be believed. But he said to the prince, "This is nothing. I can eat and eat and eat, and I can increase my size 1,000-fold. I will serve you if you will have me." So they set off together. And the next man that they met was the tall man. And first they saw a pair of feet of someone lying on the ground. And as they walked a little further, they found themselves walking along his legs. And then they found his torso. And then they found his head. And the tall man said, "This is nothing. I can stretch my height so that I'm as tall as the tallest mountain." And so the 3 of them set off together. And after a little while, they came to the listener, and they found a man lying on the ground with his ear pressed to the earth. The man said, "I am listening, for I can hear all that there is to hear. I can hear things from many miles away." So the listener became the prince's 3rd servant. And as they carried on a little further along the road, they met a man who had a blindfold over his eyes. This man was fierce gaze, and whenever he looked at anything, it would simply shatter. His gaze was so powerful, which was why most of the time he had to wear his blindfold. So the prince now had 4 servants, and he carried on. This is a very long road. He carried on along the road until he met a man who was lying in the sun. And yet, on a hot day, the man was cold and freezing. And the prince asked, and the man said, "My name is Frosty. Whenever it is hot, it has the opposite effect on me than on anyone else. I find myself freezing cold." So Frosty joined them, and the prince now had 5 servants. And as they carried on along the road, they met the 6th servant, and that man was Sharp-Eyed. And that was a man who could see into the distance, see a long, long, long way away. And so the prince and his 6 servants arrived at the castle and explained to the sorceress, that he intended to win the hand of the princess in marriage. And so the first task that the sorceress queen set the young prince was to find her ring, which she had dropped in the depths of the Red Sea. And so Farsight saw the ring. It was in the bottom of the sea, caught on a rock. And the tall man said, I could I could stoop down and pick up the ring if only I could see it. The fat man said, let me swallow all the water. So the fat man swallowed the whole of the sea into his great belly, and the tall man reached down and picked up the ring from where it was caught on the rock at the bottom of the seabed. So when the prince presented the ring to the sorceress queen, she said, yes, that's my ring. And she thought, what am I to do now? I need to find a task that the prince cannot do. So she said, in the field near the castle there are 300 oxen, and you must eat them all. Every hair, every hide, every horn, every hoof. And in the cellar of the castle are 300 barrels of wine, and you must drink them all, so that not one drop remains. And of course, you've already guessed that the fat man could simply eat all 300 oxen and drink all 300 barrels of wine. So when this was done, the queen presented the prince with his last task. And it was simply this, that he would sit for the night with the princess in his arms and would not fall asleep. And if on the stroke of midnight the princess was gone, his life would be forfeit. So the tall man made a circle around the prince and the princess, and the fat man sat by the door of her chamber so that no one could get in. And the prince sat with his arms around the princess. But by 11 o'clock, the sorceress had cast a spell, and the prince had fallen asleep into a deep slumber. And someone came into the chamber and took the princess away. But by 11:45, by 11:45 midnight, magic had worn off, and the prince awoke, but he awoke and found to his horror that the princess had gone. And so he asked Farsight where she was, and Farsight said, I can see her. She is hidden in a mountain 300 miles away. So the tall man picked up Sharp Gaze and carried him in a half a dozen strides the 300 miles to the mountain. And when Sharp Gaze took off his blindfold and looked at the mountain, the rock shattered, and there inside the mountain was the princess. And the tall man picked her up and carried her back to the castle where the prince awaited. So on the stroke of midnight, when the sorceress queen returned to her daughter's chamber, she found the prince and the princess together. And so she had no choice but to admit that the prince could indeed marry the princess. But the princess herself was a proud and haughty woman. And she said to her betrothed, "You are but a commoner," for he hadn't introduced himself as a prince. "And I do not wish to marry you." She ordered 3 piles of wood to be placed in the courtyard, and she said, "I will marry you if one of your servants will agree to be burned on the fire." And of course, Frosty, the man who, when it was very hot, became very cold, agreed to stand on the top of the bonfire. And although it burned and although it blazed, Frosty almost turned to ice in the flames. So the princess had no choice but to agree to marry the prince. So they began to travel to his land and his castle, where his father awaited them. But the prince decided that he would set a test for his betrothed. And so they had almost reached the prince's homeland when they went past a tumble-down cottage that belonged to a swineherd. And the prince said, "That is my home. The man there is my father. We must help him, and we must work looking after the pigs." So the prince took lodging in a nearby inn, and that night the innkeeper's wife took away the princess's beautiful clothes and replaced them with a half worn out skirt and woolen stockings of her own. And that was all the princess had to wear. And for a whole week she worked with the swineherd and his wife, and by the end of the week her feet were raw and bleeding. And it was then that the prince went to the little cottage and rescued the princess from the life of unexpected drudgery. And he took her to the castle and said, "Truly, I am a prince, and this is my home, and this will be your home too. I suffered so much in winning your hand. I thought it was only fair that you should suffer a little bit too." And the princess repented of her proud and haughty nature. So the prince and the princess were married, and a great wedding and a great wedding feast was held. And I think if you and I had been there, we would have danced with the rest of the guests, and we would have had a lovely time. And I think, and this is your line, are you ready? I think that the prince and the princess lived, are you ready? Happily ever after. As indeed, I hope, shall all of you. That image of being prepared to risk your life in order to win the hand of a princess, that does turn up all over the place, and I think Shakespeare even used it in Pericles, Prince of Tyre, which is a very seldom produced play, which is a shame because it is a great story in the kind of fairy tale tradition. But anyway, ladies, I do hope you get to meet your handsome prince, and I do hope he doesn't have to go to so many travails in order to win your hand. Hope to see you again soon.